Welcome to the Gentleman Project podcast. I'm Cory Moore.
And I'm Kirk Chugg. In the studio today, we have Rob Shallenberger. Rob's got quite the background. We've known Rob for a number of years now. He's been involved with the Gentleman Project and given resources and given his time to help the Gentleman Project move along. For that, we're very grateful to have him in the studio today. I'm going to let Rob kind of tell a little bit of his background, where he comes from, and what he's going to be speaking to. Rob, welcome to the podcast this morning.
Well, first of all, let me say, Cory and Kirk, it's so awesome that you're doing this. I mean, all of us are out there. We're in this together. We're trying to be better parents. There's no owner's manual, and even if there was an owner's manual with one, it's completely opposite for the next one. And so we're all in this together trying to figure this out. How do we be better parents? How do we show up? And this is a huge deal that you're doing this. So really, thank you. And, to all the listeners who are here, I want to honor them because it says a lot about their character. It says a lot about the people.
That's a good point.
You listening, the fact that you're making the time to listen to this podcast. And so I want to honor you for being here as the listener, if that's all right. Because
I love it.
Yeah, we've talked about that many times. It's long form media, and it's not just like a like and a move on scroll. If you subscribe to the podcast, you get it, and it's a download to your phone, and you spend time listening to it, and it does say a lot about the person that subscribes to this podcast.
It does, and good glimpse into your character. So thank you to you listening, and to Kirk and you, Cory, as well, for doing this. A little bit about my background. I'll give you the 2-minute version. How's that?
That sounds great.
So I grew up in Utah, had a chance to do a service mission in Bolivia for 2 years, came back, graduated from Utah State University in 2000, and then went on to fly F-16s in the Air Force for 11 years, which was just awesome.
Not only just in the Air Force, you gotta like toot your own horn a little bit here. This is a pretty cool story.
Well, what do you mean by not only in the Air Force? You got to extend on it, like the Space Force, or
no? What? Tell them what kind of a plane you flew and for whom.
Okay, so flew F-16s for 11 years, and the last year and a half had the chance to work with Air Force One, traveling around the world with Air Force One, and that was awesome too.
That's cool.
You just are around so many cool people and doing some pretty amazing things, and you're thinking, man, am I really doing this right now? And that was just an awesome experience for those 11 years.
That's so cool.
And after leaving that, together with my father, we started a company called Becoming Your Best Global Leadership, of which you are both very familiar. That's really focused on high performance, productivity, leadership. And so as a result of that, we've had the blessing to meet people all over the world, training hundreds of organizations. And that's just been, again, an honor to meet so many people. In fact, I don't think we would have connected had it not been for that.
We wouldn't have. We wouldn't have.
And so that's just been awesome, traveling around the world and meeting different people. And on the personal side of things, I have 4 kids. The oldest is Robbie. He's 19. He's on a mission as well right now, a service mission. He's in Las Vegas while waiting for a visa to go to Brazil. And then we have 3 daughters, Bella, Lana, Clara, who's 16, 13, and 10. Make sure I get those right. And so my wife says at this point, I'm girl trapped.
Yes, you are.
And yes, it's exactly right. I am girl trapped. Both of our horses are females, so I am girl trapped. But there's just a little, nutshell background. And again, I appreciate the opportunity to be here, and hopefully this conversation will be beneficial to people who are listening. I wish we could fill this room with everyone listening and get all these insights, but it's an honor to be here to have this conversation.
Yeah, I guess that's probably a pretty good segue to make an invitation that if you have feedback or you have something to say, interact with us. We're the ones that watch the social media. We'll interact with you. We'll send an email back. If you've got suggestions or something to say after listening to the podcast, we'd love to hear from you.
Yeah, good point.
Well, I think about your background, and I think, fighter jet pilot, and then getting into becoming your best. And you've got another book coming out, right?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
So what a great combination of things you've had in your life, inspiring others to become their best through your processes and systems, which I'm well read on. And your background as a fighter pilot. Wow. What some great content to give to your children.
I have pretty high expectations of myself, and hence I have pretty high expectations for others. And so it's kind of a balancing act of, how do you manage those expectations, as well as, in the fighter pilot world, we go to extensive lengths during our mission planning to plan and control what we can control. And even the things that are out of our control, we usually have a backup plan, or things like that to address those. And parenting may be similar to a degree, but what I realized is that, there's a lot of things we can't control. And so, yeah, in the fighter pilot world, we try and take a lot of those things that have been helpful and apply those to parenting. And it's been a good learning process for me over the last 10 years. And I'll share some of this here on the podcast. But yeah, there are definitely some parallels, and there's some things that don't work.
So you've had a career working with your father. That's kind of a unique opportunity. Not everybody gets that. And you've got to learn from your dad. Tell us some of those things that by working with your dad, you've been able to glean from his wisdom. He's a great guy. I've met him, and smart as a whip. And just, you want to be around a guy like that and you just absorb stuff. What have you absorbed from him?
Yeah, that's a great question, Kirk. So people always look at us and they kind of are amazed that we can work together for 10 years and still love each other so much. And I know, Cory, you have a similar relationship with your father at Big D. Let me just give you a little background on my parents. Is that all right?
Yeah,
just
absolutely.
Build on this a little bit. There's a couple of things that we grew up with in our home. Two things that they always used as a mantra or as a guide or something that was in our home. And one of those was to do your best. And the other was never give up. And I want to come back to both of those, if that's all right.
Yeah.
Because over the years, you know, our first book that Cory was alluding to there was called Becoming Your Best, The 12 Principles of Highly Successful Leaders. And my father started this research back in the 70s. When I joined him after the Air Force, we finished the research, and the whole point of that research was what sets apart great leaders from everyone else. You know, are there certain principles or habits that they focus on that help them rise to the top of their field? And these 12 principles that we found are very applicable to fatherhood, because when we say leader, leadership starts with each one of us, right? And we will either lead a life by design or we will live a life by default.
Yep.
And I can't think of a better leadership laboratory than the home. You know, you can't fire your son or daughter.
Yeah.
And we've got to figure it out. And that's such a test of leadership. So these 12 principles, and watching my dad apply them behind the scenes in his own life and with our own family, has been such reinforcement. The other thing that has been interesting to see is people hear this. I hear this all the time. They'll say, you know, you see a speaker or someone stand up on stage and they say one thing, but then in their private life, they're a totally different person. And my dad is the same in both places. And I watch him apply these principles. And this is where I want to go back to what I've learned from him, is that, you know, you use these two mantras of never give up and do your best. Let me start with do your best. This is not a competition. Parenthood, fatherhood is not a competition. And this is one of the dangers of social media, in my opinion, is we get on social media and there's this false perception that, man, everybody else is a rock star.
Yeah.
And I'm not. It's
That's a good point.
I mean, you could look at Kirk, for example, on his social media. He posts a lot about all these things he's doing with his kids. And you're like, oh, man, look at Kirk. What a great dad. But what am I doing, you know? And that's not it.
Yeah.
I don't think that's why we're here. It's to do our best. Each one of us, in my opinion, come with a capacity. And the capacity is a combination of our mindset, where we are, and our skill set. You know, what we have to draw on with what we've learned through our life. And it's our responsibility, in my opinion, as fathers, to grow our capacity and to never get stagnant. You know what? There's got to be a better way to do this or that. Well, that's part of the mindset, that willingness. Yeah. And the skill set is, well, how do we do it? And so that's one thing that's been really impactful for me is, Rob, just do your best. You know what? You're going to blow it a few times as a parent. And I certainly have plenty of times. And that's where never give up comes into play. You know, back when we were in high school, if we started a sport, we could not quit in the middle of the season. Now, if you want to stop the sport after you're done, go ahead. But once you start, you finish. Shallenbergers don't quit. That was kind of the mantra. And applying that to fatherhood, I mean, there's been times, and I'll just share this because I know that everybody listening to this is going through their own challenges. We all are.
Totally.
And to act like we're not is just not right. And there's been times where I've been on walks over the last 5 to 7 years, especially with my son, out on those walks thinking to myself, man, Rob, you suck as a father.
Yeah.
I mean, honestly, there's been times where I've cried out on a walk just thinking, man, you really blew that. But then I thought, is that the right mentality? Is that the right language to use? What good is that doing to serve you, Rob? And that's where the words, you know what, do your best, get back in the arena and never give up. Great, you made a mistake. Now what?
Move on.
And every father has done that. Every single one of us has said, ooh, man, I didn't really do really well right there.
Yeah, I think that's important to acknowledge. Yeah. You know, that if we made a mistake or messed up or raised our voice or yelled or did something that we wish we wouldn't have done, it's okay. You know what? That's part of the learning process. And so my father has taught me, do your best, never give up. And then these 12 principles, you know, be true to character and other things behind the scenes will have a huge impact in our lives if we apply those to fatherhood.
A lot of times I think we get to that point where we say, you suck as a dad, and I've made these mistakes and I can't really rectify this. When we take the chance to step up and own our mistakes, and we do it in front of or with or to our kids, it sets a great example for them that, hey, even dad screws up, and it teaches them by example of how to apologize, because they're going to screw up too. Right. And they're going to have to turn around, and they could probably turn around and apologize to a brother or sister that they've been mean to, that day. So it really sets that example of, everybody makes mistakes, even my dad.
You're good at thinking conceptually and teaching people. You mentioned the 12 steps that are inside of becoming your best of leadership. And if there's anything more important than being a father leader, I can't think of it. Are there any principles that you would say, man, if I can just get these 3 or 4 things in the head of my kids, or make these habits, right? Maybe they're from the 12. Are there things that you hope and pray, man, if I can get these things internalized in my kids, that I would be real happy?
Yeah, that is a great question. So, let me say, first of all, there's probably a lot of different answers to that question. I'd love to hear so many people's different response to that. And I respect anybody's response. Let me share 3, Cory. The first one, and again, this is just my opinion on this, is I would hope that they, above everything else, would commit to trust God. And I would hope that our children would commit to serve him. And here's why I say that, because if they do that, and it's not something that's for show, they're not out there checking a box, or to say, look how great I am, and bang the chest. If they're really doing it sincerely, trust in the Lord and wanting to sincerely serve him, then everything else will follow that. Character, the ability to treat people right and with respect and kindness will follow that if they're sincere about it. So by far and away, I think that would be my number one answer, is trust God and commit to serve him above all else. Number 2 behind that one would be to have a vision. And only 2% of adults have a written personal vision. And this is so powerful when we as adults, and especially with our children, can help them develop a vision if they're somewhat willing, right? That's the mindset part. But it's part of our role as parents is to help them sort through what their vision might look like. And we invite people to do that through the lens of their roles. So, whether they're an athlete or whatever they are, or from the parent perspective, as a father, what's my vision in the role of father? And with our kids, when we talk about vision, we often ask, what do you want to be when you grow up? Mm-hmm. And I've asked that many times. But maybe there's a better, even more important question than that. And that is not so much what do you want to be when you grow up, what title, but rather, what do you want to become when you grow up? Because regardless of the job, regardless of the title, what do you want to become? And that's what I mean by having a vision, is having their North Star, having their internal compass, and being able to articulate that. And probably the third, and the last thing I'll just share right here, is to develop the habit of what we call pre-week planning. Because if you look back on my life, and I've been doing pre-week planning for 22 years, and it's probably the most important habit that I would say we train organizations on. Because for me, it has been a total game changer in my life. And here's a very simple overlay of the process. Do you mind if I just share that?
Absolutely, please do.
Because I think this is just so important.
I've been doing this since you taught it to me years and years and years ago, and it's huge.
Okay, so I want to ask you after I explain it, just what impact it's had on you.
Perfect.
So it's when someone sits down, at some point during the weekend, usually Friday afternoon to Monday morning, and they look at their vision and their goals for the year, which again, we invite people to do by role. So father, or parent or spouse or whatever. So they start with their vision and their goals, and then they identify their roles for that week, usually 5 to 7 roles, and then what matters most in each role this week. And then they assign a time to it. So in other words, we're scheduling our priorities rather than prioritizing our schedule. We're actually looking at our life through the lens of leadership. In other words, how can I lead in these different roles? And this is the power in pre-week planning. And it's why I hope that our children adopt this habit, because it will help them throughout their lives maintain a balance of success stories across the different areas of their life. So rather than just get hyper-focused in a single area, work, early 20s, and we call that all thrust, no vector.
Yeah.
Early 20s, I'm just going to go out there and conquer the world. Well, that's great, but not at the expense of your own health, not at the expense of your family and other people. It's important to maintain that balance. And pre-week planning is that process that helps us do that. And 68% of people feel like their number one challenge is how to prioritize their time. And 80% of people don't have a process to do it. So if our children can trust God and really commit to serve him, if they can have a vision that is meaningful to them, and if they can develop the habit of pre-week planning so that every week they're looking at their different roles and what matters most in their roles that week, that would be, from my perspective, huge.
That is great advice. I love it.
So, Cory, as you've implemented that, have you been able to do that as a dad? How's that helped you?
Yeah, so very similar. On Mondays, and I'm positive I learned this from Rob many years ago, and especially probably that's when I internalized the importance of it. But yeah, the only way to be proactive is to do that. Otherwise, you're very reactive, and it doesn't matter whether you're focused on the father role, the work role, the faith role, the whatever it is that you're focused on. If you do not do that pre-week planning, and then I usually plan each day also in addition to that, well, you're not going to get done the things that are truly most important because you're going to be reactive. So the only way to achieve your vision, to achieve your goals, and to put those in the bottle first, the big rocks in the bottle first, is to do that planning. And it seems it might feel like that's a menial, not that important kind of a thing until you don't do it.
Oh yeah.
And then all of a sudden your week is not even close to as good. So that might surprise people. That's in Rob's top 3. It doesn't surprise me at all. It can change your life doing what that planning. It really can change your life.
There was a group of executives at PepsiCo. These are seasoned executives. This guy must have been in his young 60s, kind of had white graying hair. And we went through this activity with them, a pre-week planning. They just finished their vision, their goals, and now it was pre-week planning. And so we had him actually do this. Okay, let's do this for your week. And remember, these are seasoned executives. And I think this goes back to, first of all, just paused right here to acknowledge that every one of us has a challenge that most likely nobody else knows about. And that was the case with this executive. And so under the role of father, he wrote, "Call my son." Seemingly simple, right? And we asked him, well, why call your son? What's the big deal? That's great, but why? And he said, well, 7 years ago, my son and I got into an argument and we haven't talked since. We're like, what? And so this is his son's clearly an adult at this point. And that's another reminder that leadership never stops in the role of father. Doesn't matter how old our kids are. And so we asked him, well, when are you going to do it? Wednesday, 7:00. Great. And 6 months later, we were back with that same team and we saw this executive and we asked him, how did it go? Did you call your son? And he said something along the lines of this. He said, I was scared to death to pick up the phone that day. And I think we could relate as to why. Is my son going to want to talk with me? Whatever. He said, but I picked up the phone and made the call because it was there and I was going to do it. And it was amazing. He went on to say, because we started talking and we couldn't even remember what we had argued about 7 years ago. And he said, now we talk every week and we're best friends. And what was crazy about this is, he said, I went on that call to find out that I had 2 grandchildren who I didn't even know existed. Wow. We're like, what? And in his own words, he said, let me tell you, every morning I woke up knowing I needed to make that call. It was obviously a big monkey on his shoulders. But just like we tend to do with a lot of things, he said, I'll just do it tomorrow or later or next week. And of course, weeks turns into months, months turns into years, and 7 years. So there's 2 ways to look at that. One, you could say, well, it's sad it took him 7 years. But the other way to look at that is, you know what? Huge congratulations to that guy for actually making the call and doing it. And it was, and we don't need to talk more about pre-week planning after this if you don't want to, but it was pre-week planning that helped him do that. And so you say, well, yeah, that was such a small thing, but what generational impact did that have by him making the call?
Yeah, at a macro level, if you want to achieve any dream, any goal, you can't do it without planning it, right? Yeah. I think Napoleon Hill said, a goal is a dream with a deadline, right? Yeah. Well, that's what this is. It's saying, what's my ideal? What's my vision? And then actually planning to achieve it. I'm sure that many people have had dreams that never became reality because they didn't actually plan it. Right.
And many people have made things come to pass that are big and huge and world and life changing by doing it.
Totally.
Right. Setting a goal and then saying, what do I have to do this week to make that happen? And this podcast is a great example. Like Monday morning, people are going to want the podcast. And we have, it's been hard sometimes to schedule the time to get it done, to get it edited. We're recording this on a Friday. It's going to have to happen by Monday. Boy. So, but it's going to happen because we've set a goal that we're going to release the podcast every Monday. And that was in the very initial conversations that Cory and I had was, if we're going to do this, we're going to do it, and we're going to do it right. We're going to do it consistent. And so that was kind of our form of planning. And every Wednesday we have a 1-to-1, and whether it's a phone call, whether it's a Zoom, whatever it might be, maybe just an email, but we touch base and say, hey, are we on track with our goal? And that's been huge.
Yeah. Do you mind if I share a 30-second thought on
yes,
this?
Go ahead.
Finish
Absolutely.
the thought on pre-week planning. I'm not here to promote our products nor nothing else. But,
we know that.
But if someone wants to start this process, a lot of times it's like, well, how do I do it? Do you have a template or a form? If you go to preweekplanning.com, people can download a free PDF that they can use as part of pre-week planning, and it will walk through each of the steps on how to do this. And since we're talking about fatherhood, these are little things that can add up to be enormous, like what you're talking about. This week, maybe it's write a note to Lana. Maybe it's to play basketball with your son, to go on a daddy-daughter date, to read a book at night. It's the summation of these little things that ultimately, over the course of months and years, add up to be immeasurable in their impact.
Yeah. So I know of one of those things that you've kind of helped your kids achieve one of their goals. Would you talk to us about your daughter's book?
I was not planning on it, but okay, since you brought that up. So, and again, the statistics behind this are you're 90% more likely to accomplish something when you have a clearly written goal. There's something about having a target. And so you asked earlier, Cory, about bringing the fighter pilot stuff in. These are very natural things from the fighter pilot world that we have tried to bring into our kids' lives that do work and that do make a difference. And so every year we have our kids sit down and come up with their roles and goals. What is their role? And then 1 to 4 goals in each role. And, the way you word the goal matters. You don't use words like more or better, be a better communicator. And so we sit down and we go through each one with them. Well, at age 11, our daughter, Bella, came up with the role of author. And I thought, okay, that's kind of a cool role. I didn't even know you wanted to write a book. Mm-hmm. And so we came up with our goal and ultimately tweaked it. And it ended up being to write a children's book by December 20th. Mm-hmm. So we decided to make this a father-daughter project, and we went to work on it, and we came up with this title of A to Z, the best in you and me. And so we went through the alphabet, and Bella came up with a word that associates with each letter. So A is attitude, B is beautiful. And then I would send it off to an illustrator in India, and he'd come back with the design, and then Bella and I would approve it together. And then the other thing Bella would do is come up with a little quote or description for each word and what that means. So for example, beautiful says, you are a beautiful person. Being beautiful is not just a look, it's a way to live. So be true to you and be beautiful. Cool. And then we decided to add a question at the bottom of every page so that a parent or a grandparent could have a discussion with their children and make it interactive. And I know you have the book, Kirk, right?
Mm-hmm. I do. I've read it with my kids.
And the intent there was to actually have some interchanges, whether they know the word or not. What a great chance to sit there and talk about them with words such as beautiful, courage, dream, forgiveness, patience. And, the goal is to finish on December 20th. We have a picture of us standing on the back porch holding the 2 finished copies that I paid $45 for each to get them done by December 20th on our back porch.
Yeah, that's cool.
And I'll just share one last thought on this, if that's all right. What's the power of a goal? Bella's goal was to write a children's book by December 20th. I thought, okay, that's kind of a cool goal. I had no idea that it would be so deep and so meaningful. It may be the most important book we ever write, because whether I'm gone or she's gone, we'll always have that we did together. And I remember that night going up, Kirk, and I read it with my youngest daughter, Clara, who was 7, and I opened it to the page beautiful. And I went through that description that I just mentioned, and then I asked her, Claire, what are some beautiful things about you? And I'm all ready for this great answer. And she looks at me, and she's 7 years old. She said, Dad, there's nothing beautiful about me. I'm ugly. And I thought, what? I could not believe that the programming of the world had already crept into her young mind at 7 years old. That was one of those crushing moments. I just couldn't believe it. Mm. So for the next 2 weeks, every night we'd sit down and talk about all the beautiful things about Clara. And now when I ask her, she says, I know, my golden hair and my smile, blah, blah, blah. We would have never probably had that conversation had it not been for Bella's book.
Wow.
And I think my takeaway for that is that if an 11-year-old can do it, anybody can do it.
That's awesome. What a cool, motivating story. I asked you to talk about that because I remember reading it with my kids, and they were similar age. And I said, hey, you know how old the author of this book is? And it was motivating to them because they said, wow, I didn't know that you could write a book when you were that young.
Well, isn't that interesting? That's the mindset piece of the equation, isn't it?
It's the programming that the world teaches everybody, that they've got to wait till a certain age to do anything impactful.
So that moment in time was a strengthening moment between you and both your daughters, really. And it's been a strengthening moment. I have the book too. I've read it with my kids. It's wonderful. Thank you. What other things do you do to build your relationships? What other things do you do to try to strengthen your interpersonal relationships with your kids?
That's a good question, Cory. And I don't know that I have all the right answers on this. There's a lot that I'm sure I'm missing on this. One of the things that I've found is that with at least our kids, that it's both quantity and quality. Quality is great, but if we have a great quality evening with one of our kids and that happens once every other month, that's not enough.
Sure.
At the same time, if we're there with them, but we're not there, in other words, we're there physically, but we're not present with them, that's not enough in my opinion. And so that goes back to my dad's advice way back when of do your best. How do we really do our best to spend quality time and quantity time? And so, not to come back to pre-week planning, but every week, and as part of my pre-week planning, I try to plan in there something. Sorry, I don't want to use the word try. That's a weak word. I plan into something each week in my pre-week planning that we can do together. And, so we have a family activity, and then I'm very conscious to plan in something with every one of my kids one-on-one each week. And so it's just trying to make time. And in our culture, we oftentimes hear the phrase, I really want to do whatever, I'm just too busy.
Yeah.
And we almost wear that as a badge of honor sometimes. And I think, to take some of the direction that we've been talking about here, that fatherhood and motherhood, for that matter, are probably the two most important places that we have in this life to lead. And a wise man once said, and I'm sure everyone listening to this, or at least most people have probably heard it, that, no success in business can compensate for failure in the home. And so it's just a combination of really trying to balance that quantity and quality time. And so whether it's going skiing, or whether it's going out snowshoeing, or whether it's just reading a book or even watching a movie, even though that's not maybe the most interactive experience, but it's time together. So I don't know if that answers the question, but I just try to really balance in my pre-week planning. Am I really doing justice to both quantity and quality?
You've had a lot of experience with that because 4 kids, and every week you've had an experience with each one of those kids. If your pre-week planning goes as planned, what were some of those experiences that you could say, similar to with Clara and the book? What were some of those things that you could say maybe to our listeners who might not have an idea of what they could go do with their teen or what they could go do with their 3-year-old? What are some of the things that you've done, like practical ideas for one-on-one time with your kids that you've tried that might be creative and unique?
I'd say follow Kirk Chugg on Facebook and do what he does.
Yeah, I don't know that that's the best advice.
No, actually, that's a good idea. Do that. But in addition, again, there's simple things. And here's something, this is what I mean by we're all learning as parents. I was in Bear Lake at my in-laws last summer. And, I'm trying, my daughter Bella is 16. And so I'm trying to do something with Bella. Hey, Bella, how about if we go on a 4-wheeler ride? No, I don't want to. How about if we go do this? No, I don't want to. I'm like, okay, well, I can force you.
It'll be really fun.
We're going to have a great experience together, and it's going to be fun. That's not going to work. So I'm sitting there, and I'm like, well, dang, she doesn't want to do anything. And Daryl, my brother-in-law, and it was so wise. He's a couple years older than I am. He said, why don't you find out what she wants to do, and then start there. And so we asked, hey, Bella, do you want to go get an ice cream? Heck yeah. So we took the 4-wheeler over, and we went and got an ice cream. So I wasn't thinking about her language. I was just thinking about all these things in my mind that I thought would be fun. And that's been a constant reminder to me is getting into finding out what motivates and drives them and what's fun to them and doing those kind of things. So yeah, I listed off a few things: skiing, snowshoeing. The reservoir near our house is frozen over, so we went and played on the ice the other day. We have 2 horses. Bella loves to ride horses. Claire loves to ride horses. Lana doesn't. So horse rides are always a win. But it could be as simple as going and playing pickleball. But it really does. I think it's not so much what I want. It's finding out what they want to do and what do they get excited about, and then just go doing that. And it's hard to do. And mind if I take one more minute to share something my dad did with me?
Yeah,
Absolutely.
Our ability to influence others is commensurate with the level of trust we have with that person. And if you think about that, that's actually a pretty deep statement. Our ability to influence others is commensurate with the level of trust we have with that person, to include our children. And, when I was 16 and 17, that was a pretty tough time in my life. I didn't have any direction. I didn't have any vision. I wasn't even on course to make it through high school at that point and graduate. So, I was just trying to figure out life. And thank heavens I had a dad who was engaged. And I'm sure he was going through all of these emotional things, trying to figure out, how do I connect with Rob? What do I do? Kind of like that question. Hey, Rob, do you want to go do this? No. How's things going? Fine.
The one-word answer, silent treatment. Yeah.
I
remember going through that myself.
Go back in time and kick myself if I could. And so that was the phase where I was at in life. And my dad would say, if you had this imaginary trust meter, it was probably on a half or a quarter tank, if you will. And so he did what we're talking about here. He's like, well, what does Rob like to do? Well, I was out there playing basketball in our yard a lot. And so he's like, I need to connect with him on his level. No lectures, no nothing else, just connect. No behind the scenes motivation to use this as a teaching opportunity, nothing, just connect. Mm-hmm. And so he came out and started shooting the basketball with me. And I remember he'd ask, how's school? Fine. How are friends? Fine. But that started to change. And after a few weeks of sincerely just being out there shooting the basketball with me, we started to have some real conversations. And there started to be real connect, and the trust level started to go up. And I think he probably remembers those a lot more than I do, but I do remember something started to change. And he later connected those dots with me. And so I'm not sure that it matters specifically all these little things that we can do. It certainly does, quality, quantity, but it's doing them and doing them without a hidden agenda, and just having those relationships and trust there with our kids. So I don't know if that made sense or even if it answers your question.
No, it does. And it actually brings me back to, we wrote the daily doodads.
That's right.
For the Gentleman Project, and it was several years worth of them. And it was an idea that you could do with your kids once a day, text it to you. There were days that I had no idea what I was going to send at 4:45 to the hundreds of people that got this text. And my go-to was to turn to my daughter, who's my youngest now, who's 9, and say, Paisley, what do you want to go do with Dad right now? And she would more often than not give me the answer that became the doodad.
Huh.
That was where a majority of those came from, was me turning to my kids and saying, if we could drop everything and go do something together right now, what would it be? And I think it's a powerful question that maybe we don't ask enough. And I believe that was one of the very first texts that we sent was, what do you want to go do? If we've got 10 minutes. I'll drop everything I have. What do you want to go do? I have 10 minutes right now. Let's go. Try that with your kids. It's pretty magic.
That's a great question.
Is a good one. So we talk often about the things that we should do as parents, right? Like the proactive, the right things to do. But sometimes the best lessons and the best aha moments come from going back and looking and saying, what should I have done different? Right. I think some of my best advice is to other people is always, well, this is where I messed up. Don't do this. So maybe in a more vulnerable way, Rob, you could talk to us about, are there any lessons learned or things where you look back and you go, oh man, I wish I would have tweaked this or done this a little different?
And I'll share one that's very personal, if that's okay with you.
Please.
Too.
Yeah.
But this has been a real struggle for me over the last 4 years, particularly the last year and a half. And that was watching my son, who is an amazing young man. He also had the ability to push my buttons like nobody else in the world. Nobody could push my buttons like he could.
He knew
you. The only one that had that access point. And I don't know if any other fathers can relate to that. I'm sure
I can.
Yeah.
It's like nobody else has access to that button, but he can push it. And, you know, I mentioned earlier, I have pretty high expectations for others, including myself. And I think that translates to my kids. And in my opinion, expectations are a great thing. People rise to expectations. But here's the caveat I'll put on that. And that is, as long as our love is not attached to those expectations. Mm-hmm. And so, yes, having high expectations, people tend to rise to that. But if they don't, that's okay. Our love, and they need to know this, that our love can't be contingent upon those expectations. And so, you know, you look from the outside at my son. I'm going to use this example. He's done a lot of great things. He played football, was on the ski team, played the piano in Israel at Carnegie Hall, you know, did some different things. So from the outside, you say, you know, sharp guy, just got into BYU, got a scholarship for ROTC, wants to be a fighter pilot.
Cool.
Despite me trying to push him the surgeon path or some other route. Actually, I love it. I know what goes into flying a fighter, and you know that. Separate thing.
Part of you says, watch out, and part of you says, I'm so proud of you.
Exactly. Well said, Cory. Exactly. So anyway, on the outside, you look at him and say, well, this is a really sharp young man. But on the inside, I had a lot of these what ifs. And what I didn't realize is how far down this fortune-telling trail I had gone. And by fortune-telling, we don't usually fortune-tell into the positive. We usually fortune-tell into the negative. Like, well, what if this happens? You know, he's supposed to be back at 11. It's 11:05. Well, what if he's this? And then this, and then he's going to lose the scholarship. Where did that all just come from? Mm-hmm. I had all of that worry and all of these things, and two things happened. You know, my wife and I talked about this a lot, and it was about midway through his senior year, and somewhere she had heard this phrase, and she said, Rob, you've got to throw away the script. And I'm like, well, what do you mean by throw away the script? And sure enough, as we talked about it, what she meant by that is I had all these things mapped out in my mind of what an awesome young man should look like, of what my son should look like. You know, he's my only son, so there's this vested interest, right? And if my son wasn't doing something along that line, then he wasn't following my script. And so whether it's in a family relationship or with an employee or a team member or whatever, you know, one of the greatest reasons for people leaving a company or divorce or whatever is frustration. And frustration comes from misaligned expectations.
Yeah.
And so I had this expectation, what I'll call the script, in my mind of what Robbie should look like. And although he was meeting a lot of great things from the outside, he wasn't, you know, church starts at 9, he's there at 9:05. What's going on? You know, it's such a small thing in the big picture of things, you know, whatever. But it was part of my script. And it didn't happen overnight. But once I realized that I needed to throw away my script, it doesn't mean that I still don't have expectations and help him try and develop the habit of pre-week planning and all these things. But it was that my happiness and my worry was no longer attached to that. And I quit fortune telling too. You know, well, what if this happens? What if he doesn't do that? Then what? And it's just it was a bunny trail that really wasn't taking me any place positive. And here was the other thing that was the catalyst for throwing away the script and really stopping that fortune telling. It was one Sunday afternoon, and I'd really been praying a lot that day on his behalf. Very clearly, and this is a personal experience, but I think it's good for fathers to hear this. Very clearly, the words came to my mind, and it said, Rob, he was my son before he was your son. Mm-hmm. Your responsibility is to love him. I've got this. I've gone back to that anchor so many times. And so, you know, I would call that a parenthood failure, if you will, but I'd also call it one of those lessons learned, Cory, that you're talking about is, and now it's totally different with my daughters. We still have expectations. We have a curfew and we have other things, but I've thrown away the script, if that makes sense. And if they make mistakes, so what? I mean, if I look back at my own teenage years, good grief. And so throwing away that script and not fortune telling in the negative. But if I'm going to fortune tell, it's almost always going to be to the positive from this point forward. And that's a very conscious effort to do that because I had become a very good fortune teller to the other side of the equation. And then really trusting that there's a higher power that has this, that is vested in our children who are his children before they were our children.
I love that. It's like you don't want to get in the way of their destiny. It's funny how many people have gone through pretty tough things, right? Whether they had parents who abused them or they didn't do well in school. And then you look at some of those people, they become some of the most successful people in our world, right? Whether they become great entrepreneurs or whether they become good parents themselves. We've had people on the podcast who came through such a hard time growing up and had trouble and were lost. And that's what turned them into such a great parent. So I love the idea of don't script, love unconditionally, don't fortune tell, but inspire them to become their best, but don't get in the way of their destiny, because sometimes destiny is bigger than us, right?
It's easier said than done, isn't it? I mean, because we want to see our kids succeed. I don't think there's a parent out there that says, yeah, I want my kid to be a failure.
Right.
We want them to succeed. And it's hard when someone is doing something that you know is going to hurt them.
Yeah. But I think it comes back to that core value that you talked about, which is if I build a level of trust and unconditional love,
yeah,
then we can probably get through anything together, right?
It's a great point.
Yeah. I love that. I love that lesson learned. That's a good one.
Rob, you told my kids a motto. I'd like you to leave that with our audience, because I think it's powerful for our personal progression as parents and gives hope. My kids still remember it. Can you leave it with our audience today?
Yeah, there's 3 that we use in our home just in one sentences, and then I'll share the one you're talking about.
Okay.
We use dream big, trust the Lord, and never give up. So, we adopted some of those. The one you're referring to is one of our favorite quotes, and it's how we actually start every one of our trainings or seminars in our company. And it goes like this: good, better, best, never let it rest till the good is better and the better is best. In other words, never being just satisfied with good. What can I do? And it's the whole purpose of this podcast, right? I mean,
Totally.
What are our blind spots? What are we not aware of as parents? What areas could we do better in? If I wouldn't have had that conversation with my wife, having her tell me about throwing away the script, if I would not have had that conversation with my brother-in-law, hey, Rob, find out what she wants. Mm-hmm. Look at all these outside influences that have helped me be a better father. And so each one of us asking, you know what? Life may be good. What can we do to be better? And it's part of why we're here on this earth, in my opinion, is to continue to get better and better. And it's a long process of refinement. It's 2 steps forwards. It's 1 step back. It's okay to make mistakes. It's okay to be human.
Yeah.
Are we going up the escalator? If so, it doesn't matter where we're at on the escalator as long as we're going that direction.
Yeah, it's about progression. Well, you're an impressive guy that I think anybody could look to as an example for pretty much any role in their life. And you've kind of fed us with some really great stuff today. And I know that what you've said today is going to impact some of our listeners. It's impacted me. It's motivated me. It's motivated me to get back on my pre-week planning, because I know how important that is. And sometimes you just get lazy, and you can tell in your life when you're, I had a friend one time, he says, you know what a derelict is? And I'd only heard it as a derogatory term referring to like a drunk or something, like, oh, he's a derelict. Well, a derelict is a vessel without a rudder. And if you don't have a rudder, you can't steer. So sometimes you feel like maybe I'm just floating out here. And I think that planning, that direction, those goals, that progression, giving yourself a break every once in a while can help you give you that rudder back so that you can steer in a direction that you want your vessel to go. And I think if you're listening to this podcast, you're interested in that. You've given yourself the capacity, and now it's the skill set. So some of the things I think you said today are very, very powerful. It's going to help me in my skill set. I don't know about you, Cory, but
I have one.
There's very few people that I can say in my life live up to the standards that I have for Rob Shallenberger.
Yeah, amen. This guy's amazing.
Pretty incredible.
I want to end with one question, Rob, and that is, because this is the Gentleman Project podcast, what does it mean to you to be a gentleman?
That is a great question. And I would probably answer this different now than I would have maybe a year ago. I think the answer for me is in the actual word, a gentle man. And it's to carry the same theme that we've been talking about, is someone who can, their children know that the love is unconditional, that there's a side of gentleness. And part of my vision and the role of my father is to be an example in thought and deed of what a true gentleman looks like. And a gentle man, in my opinion, and I don't always do this with my wife, so I just want to caveat, I'm far from perfect in this, but that's why we have the vision, right?
Amen.
Instead of focusing on the problem, we go back to our internal compass. A gentleman can open the door for his wife and his girls. And so I've tried to do this every Sunday morning, and I use the word try because I miss a few times. When we go to church, I go out there and I open the door, and I help my daughters out, trying to hopefully show them what I would hope their future husband may have. And so a gentle man or gentle woman is someone who's gentle and can show love. Doesn't mean that, we can't rise and have high expectations and be a go-getter and a hustler, but that there's an unconditional love. I don't know. Does that make sense?
I love it. No, it's fantastic.
And I love how the variety of the way that question gets answered. Yeah. So often it's like, it means something different to like everybody. So I don't know if you're listening, how would you answer that question?
Yeah.
It'd probably be different than I would answer it, probably different than Cory or Rob would answer it, and different than maybe anybody else who's answered it on the program. So I think for me, and after today's conversation, a gentleman is my vision. A gentleman is what I want to become. A gentleman is what I want my kids to become. And that was the magic when we started the Gentleman Project, was it gave my sons something to shoot for. It was what they wanted to become, like you said earlier.
Can I share one more thought before we wrap up?
Please.
One of the things that I really credit my dad and mom with doing was, even though I was barely making it through high school at the time, is they put us in situations where seeds could be planted. My original vision to become a fighter pilot came from sitting in the Stadium of Fire when these F-16s flew by, and I thought, oh man, that's so awesome. I want to do that. And that was the seed of a vision. And so what you're talking about there, Kirk, by doing this podcast and by people listening repeatedly week after week and subscribing to it, and making it a part of their routine, and maybe even sharing it with their teenage sons or daughters. When we're in the car, we control the radio. We have a captive audience. And so by putting our children in places where seeds can be planted, even sometimes they may not want to be there, but we never know when they may hear something or when catch something. And I love what both of you are doing, with your children. I've watched you for years, and you're putting them in situations where seeds can be planted. And from the fatherhood perspective and teaching our children what a gentleman is, to be able to plant those seeds is so important. Going to your cabin, Kirk, having them help you build it. These little things that we do plant seeds. It puts them in places where they can see and observe, and maybe the seed is planted.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, thank you so much for joining us on the Gentleman Project podcast today. We've been greatly fed today. We invite you to subscribe to the podcast if you haven't yet. Share it with those that you think might find value in it. Rob Shallenberger, becomingyourbest.com. If you want to find out more information about pre-week planning or whatever you want, this guy's pretty incredible. And again, probably give him a follow. And if you want more of Rob Shallenberger in your life, like we all should, you can find him online as well. If you have any questions, comments, email us at info@thegentlemanproject.com. I'm Kirk Chugg.
And I'm Cory Moore.
Thanks for joining us today.